Well, explaining in the last lecture, qualitative data analysis is a lens that allows us to see our data more clearly. But there are different kinds of lenses, and these tend to provide us with different approaches on how we interpret data. So the first of these I'm going to talk about is kind of like using a magnifying glass or a microscope, and that's called a rich description. And it's a detailed description that thoroughly answers the question of what's going on here. That's where you take all of your data and you put together some kind of analysis that seeks to explain all of it. And the advantage is that it generally helps provide a depth of detail about the data that goes beyond summary. You're really turning over every rock and looking at every nook and cranny. But the drawback is that it tends to be highly interpretive. It often depends very much on the researcher and how they are viewing it, and it's often bogged down in nuance. And researchers love nuance, and research audiences tend not to love nuance so much as they love application and insights and action. So it's important, if you're going to use rich description, to understand the right context and the right audience for it. I would suggest it's best for exploration or for drilling down, and it's best for audiences who really need to have a deep understanding of something. It is not good for executives or high-level managers or other people who just need to understand the key takeaways. So another process that we might use is induction. And think of induction as being like reading glasses or cheaters, when you need to look at something up close and scrutinize it, but you're still going to be kind of looking at it from a little bit further away. And this is where, and I have here, the logical development of a general explanation from repeated observations that show a similar theme. And basically what we're talking about here is that we're going to take our data, we're going to look at them one by one, and then we're going to allow that to lead us to general conclusions. We're going to draw inferences based on what we see in our data or observations. And that is actually how a lot of qualitative data analysis is conducted, with an inductive framework. And as we're going to talk about when we talk about grounded theory a little bit later in this series, it is a good method, and it's very rigorous and useful in many ways. So one of the advantages of it is that we're going to use the frequency of data to draw conclusions, and it's easy for non-researchers in particular to understand. If we see a theme cropping up over and over and over, it's probably a real theme, something that we can easily grasp. But the problem with induction is that it also tends to identify extremes. So you're going to see a lot of the boundaries in your data as you start looking for frequencies. And those extremes can sometimes be misleading because they may be outliers. They may be idiosyncratic. They may be things that aren't really part of the themes that you're looking for. And induction can often also be oblivious to nuance or variation, particularly because we don't have anything outside of the data that we're looking at to help us kind of ground what we're saying to broader reality. So another tool that we might use in the same vein is deduction. And deduction is kind of like using a pair of binoculars, looking at things from far away and trying to think about what we think we're going to see and then trying to see if we actually see it. And deduction is the logical development of an explanation for a particular situation from general knowledge about circumstances. So we're going to start with a theory about what we'll find. We'll develop some hypotheses that we can then examine our data to test to see if they confirm it or suggest an alternative explanation, and then we can refine our theory appropriately. And probably the biggest advantage of deductive forms of analysis is that they are similar to quantitative analysis. So people that are used to quantitative analysis will have an easier time understanding deduction and hypothesis testing. It makes a lot more sense to them. But the drawback of deduction, for one, is that it's very difficult to generalize. You can see things within your data set, but if your data set is not sourced from a random sample, or if it's not rigorous enough to really stand up to a lot of scrutiny, you have to restrict your findings to what that data set has to say. And often, if the data are lacking, you have to be open to counter explanations that also mean that your theory or your hypotheses may not fully be able to be tested and improved if your data are not sufficient. So students often get the distinction between induction and deduction confused. So let me just take a moment, and let's say somebody gives you a bag of coins and they tell you that it's worth $10 in American dollars, but you don't know what's inside. A deductive approach might be to predict what sorts of coins you'll find based on your prior knowledge about the person who gave you the coins. So they're probably going to give me American coins if they're giving me American dollars because they're an American person, right? The size of the bag, the weight of the bag, the way the coins jingle as you shake the bag, and so forth. You're going to use those kinds of cues to build a theory about what you're going to find inside. And when you pull your first coin out of the bag, you'll either confirm your initial hypothesis or you'll be forced to refine it. Subsequent coins are going to either provide support for your theory or force you to adopt new hypotheses to test to refine your theory. That's deductive reasoning, and the strength is that you're going to have a stronger theory when you're finished. But the problem is that your initial theory may be wildly wrong. You may assume that everything in the bag is quarters and your first few coins are all pennies. And if that happens, you're going to need to collect a lot of data in order to refine your hypotheses and your ultimate theory. So deduction can be useful because you're using a lot of prior knowledge, but it can be difficult if your data don't line up with what your theory has to say. So induction, on the other hand, is about pulling out coin 1 and then forming a theory. Then you pull out coin 2 and refine that theory, and then you pull out coin 3 and 4 and 5 and so on, and you continue to refine. And the strength of induction is that you don't need a lot of data to begin creating a theory that fits what your data are showing you. If every coin you pull out's a penny, you may conclude that all of the coins in the bag are pennies. The danger, though, is that induction can lead you to non-logical thinking. If every coin you pull out's a penny, you may conclude that all of the coins in the bag are pennies, but that's not a logical conclusion. That's just based on a little bit of data. You may be wrong due to simply drawing out a bunch of pennies when there are still other coins in the bag, and you're basing your theory purely on your observation. So your theory is never going to be quite in line with your reality until you conduct every possible observation to make sure that you're right. So you have to be aware that induction has some pretty serious dangers about oversights. It's still a good method. It's still useful, but deduction allows you to test things and to continue to grow and refine your hypotheses based on prior knowledge, whereas induction is more about just taking what you have and building your theory from that. And that's how you distinguish those two. Okay, so we have two other ideas as well, nomothetic and idiographic. And both of these are different ways in which you can look at people. Nomothetic is like using a wide-angle lens. And this is kind of the governing principle of quantitative research and sociology. It's the search for common themes that are assumed to dictate more general behavior or perceptions within a population under study. So in other words, when we're taking a macro-level approach at a group of people, we're looking for commonalities between them rather than looking for individual characteristics. And the advantage of a nomothetic point of view is that it offers some explanation for variation within a group, and it generalizes rules for behavior or perception. So it allows us to understand what's normative behavior, what should we expect to see from this group, and if we see deviation, we can understand that it is deviation. But the drawback is that variation may be more than individual in nature. So we think that we see something that really has to do with an individual acting differently, but it might actually be something that there is a subgroup that's behaving this way, and we just don't have a large enough sample to detect it. And particularly in qualitative research, we have to be careful about a nomothetic point of view, because we often are working with small, non-probability-based samples. So we also have to acknowledge as well that explanations of what we're seeing can be highly interpretive. We're looking at a large group, we're trying to understand what the group is doing, we're interpreting, and we're not actually necessarily hearing what the individuals have to say or considering what they have to say in a manner that allows us to understand why every individual person acts in a certain way. So we often use nomothetic perspective in a quantitative analysis because it's focused on trying to isolate similarities between individuals rather than trying to consider individuals as individual actors. It's still useful for qual, though, and we might use it to identify profiles, personas, segments, or behavior patterns that we can then apply to groups of people within our qualitative set and then begin to qualify them more individually as we're thinking about them. And if we really want to think about them as pure individuals, we'll take a more idiographic point of view, and that's like having a zoom lens where you're just zooming in on that one face. And the focus on the individual as a unique case is what we're looking at here, examining context and individual behavior as being meaningful aspects of behaviors and perceptions. And one of the advantages here is that it offers some ability to compare and contrast different stories with the research framework. But a drawback is it's difficult to generalize. We often get so focused on personal nuance and context that we have trouble taking this to the next level and talking about a group of people. And this is actually one of the dangers of ethnography. Ethnography is very idiographic. So we tend to think about how individuals think and feel, but we don't necessarily have a way to apply that. Think about focus groups. Focus groups tend to be a little bit more nomothetic, because we're thinking about what a group of people are saying or how they're responding to things. So when you're comparing those two types of data, you have a very different use and application of what you can do with that. I will say, though, idiographic perspective is really useful in qual and much more so than in quant because it focuses on the individual. And it tends to apply more methods like subject matter expert interviews or ethnography than methods that we commonly use in qualitative marketing research like IDIs or focus groups. So if you're going to go idiographic, it's generally going to be with real high context situations. It's also important to consider the framework that we're using for qualitative data analysis, and these can be broadly categorized in two buckets, realism and constructivism. And think about realism as being like a traditional camera, like, a DSLR or a little hand camera or something like that, something you can hold. That's going to take just pictures that you snap, even maybe your cell phone camera. This is the common sense view of the world that accepts that the world exists materially around us, that it predates our experience, and that we can perceive the reality around us without it being changed by our perspective on it. Realism is more focused on what can be concretely understood, and it tends to be to view more abstract ideas like attitudes, power structures, social norms, and so forth as being independent of perception. So in other words, there is some kind of truth that exists beyond our perception that is real, and that's what we can find through research. And the advantage of realism is that it's an easy perspective for many people to understand intuitively. What you see is what you get. The drawback, though, is it struggles with abstract perspectives, particularly where individual perception may not fully be able to describe the truth of what an abstract concept really is. So just think about going to court, for example. Very rarely does what someone says on a witness stand actually match the complete reality of what they observed, unless they're relying on some other medium like a video recording or something like that. A lot of times their memory or their perceptions are at odds with the reality of what actually happened. And that's not because they did anything wrong, it's just because they have a point of view that is flawed. Everyone has a point of view that is personal and which it taints their perspective a little bit, and which prevents us from getting completely to the truth, even if we hear from lots and lots of people very similar ways. We're going to hear a lot of variation. So realism is something that is kind of an ideal, but it's not necessarily a reality. And so that's where constructivism comes in. Constructivism is kind of like having computer-aided graphics touching us up or giving us some superpowers or other things like that. And that's the more detached view of the world that suggests that we are limited by our perceptions, and we can only understand what we perceive through constructs and ideas that exist within us or our culture. Constructivism holds that the world we inhabit is shaped by multiple realities that are constructed by social structures. And I'm not talking about parallel universes here. I'm saying that my reality that I experience is a little bit different from yours. We have a lot of common ground, but I perceive the world differently. I see the world differently. I respond to it differently. And so what's real for me is not necessarily what's real to you. And as a result, we cannot describe actual reality with 100% certainty, but merely what reality appears to be when filtered through the lens of biased observers. And by the way, in my many years of doing research and reading up on social science, this is the viewpoint that I tend to feel is more reflective of what we see in data. We often see that perception does not match reality, so constructivism or idealism is a very useful framework to understand. The advantage of constructivism is it opens up interpretation of contradictory truths to a more relative understanding of behaviors or perceptions within a population. In other words, we see variation, we can say, well, it's not due to things being flawed, it's due to different people perceiving these things in different ways and having different expectations or needs. A drawback is that struggles with making declarative statements about findings are definitely an issue because everything is couched in perspective and the nuance of the observer. So just keep in mind that if you go to constructivism, you can't necessarily say anything is 100% true because you're always relying on perspective. Okay. I don't want you to walk away thinking qualitative analysts favor one of these techniques or frameworks, and in fact, they often utilize several of them in the course of analysis. And what's important to understand is the type of perspective that they yield. Each of these lenses provides a researcher with a different tool for analysis, and each results in a different perspective. Of course, before we apply these lenses, we need to make sure our data are ready to be examined, And in our next lecture, we're going to talk about how to prep data for analysis.